Hey guys, this is Andy with Troglodyne here with another stream with my brother George.
Hey.
We are going to talk today about something that's ripped from the headlines, so to speak. Trump ordering all of the critical theory classes for corporations that have government contracts to cease immediately. Oh, big scary language there, huh?
Yeah, it's certainly highly doubtful that anybody's going to do anything about it until after the election, if anything, because if there's no re-election, I doubt this order will stand 15 seconds. But supposing it does end up standing, it has some interesting consequences for all the firms that were previously either offering it optionally or mandating critical theory training on, in particular, the race, identity, and gender subjects, right?
Yeah, which is somewhat interesting because though I've never worked at a company that has that mandatorily offered, yes, I've been at some places where that was optional. And it makes me somewhat curious how that's going to affect a lot of development organizations because certainly that doesn't seem to be something that's been as big when I was, in that sort of stuff, and still to some extent, like I can see some of the influence of critical theory, but I'm not seeing it pushed like at where I'm currently at, something like that. It may be different in other companies, so I'd be somewhat curious to see how much impact this has on current development organizations. But
Yeah, as far as I can tell, most organizations are not really into it from a philosophical point of view.
and why would they be
Yeah,
if
there's
they
no
actually
reason
read
to
it?
be.
It's rather nihilistic. So
Yeah, the philosophy behind critical theory is all about Derrida, Foucault, Sartre, all those French guys from the 70s, essentially. And they all essentially, their conclusion was nihilism that, well, no, actually, it doesn't. It turns out that, gender and identity and race and all this stuff, it's all made up and it doesn't matter. So be nihilist.
right.
Camus even reacted by just saying, whatever, become a hedonist. It doesn't matter.
Hey,
Yeah.
and that kind of goes back to say even some of Baudrillard and some of the Matrix stuff, where it's like, well, yeah, you're just constructing hyper realities around all this sort of stuff. So construct the one that serves you.
And that's really what we're trying to get to here today is the sort of narrative that's being pushed as part of the modern critical theory package. You can just sort of see it as this whole package. Uh, does this serve your company? Is this matrix that you're sort of jacking yourself into and your company by extension, does this actually serve your corporate goals? And that's the real question. I mean, most of the way that it's actually coming in is through things like anti-harassment training, which are necessary due to the legal climate and protected classes and so forth. So
Which
uh,
is somewhat of an inside out approach, and even though that's still going to alienate
well, if you're not a
people.
protected class, you're a
Yeah.
second-class citizen, right?
Well, at least that's the impression you get whenever you go through those trainings. But
Oh, and it's certainly the practical reality of the situation.
right. But regardless of those, it's still an inside out approach where you're not really getting some sort of buy in from your employees as far as like they don't have to philosophically, like they ain't gotta believe
Yeah, and
in
at
this sort
some
of
level,
thing.
everybody
They just
knows
have
that
to
it's got,
understand what's going on and not run afoul, right?
yeah, that it's just you don't cause these troubles that'll get you in legal headaches and peace be upon thee.
Whereas it sounds more like if you're say mandating critical theory, something like that, it
It's going above and beyond what your legal requirements are, and I think the reason some of them are mandating it is probably because they're anticipating this becoming shifting from not really necessary into color of law. Being
okay.
applied to the
Okay.
existing regulations on anti-harassment statutes and so
That
forth.
certainly makes a lot of sense because of the climate in both the universities and in the state houses of many states
Yeah,
and
because
that sort of thing. Because that definitely seems to be a trend towards favoring the conclusions of critical theory, not necessarily all on board with the nihilism train, but more like about half measures onto critical theory's conclusions.
yeah, certainly the latest crop of university graduates are going to be exposed to this to some degree, which means that they're going to, some of them at the very least, are going to internalize the idea that, sort of offending my worldview, which is based on critical theory, is literally harassment, because, I mean, that's how postmodernism works. I mean, you're creating these little worlds inside
These
your own
hyper
head.
realities, yeah.
Yeah, and essentially anything goes in there. And so the question, of course, is whether the reasonable man standard in the court is going to extend to this hyper reality. If we actually had a decision in a court that said essentially that a reasonable person inside this other person's hyper reality that they've created would do the same thing or feel the same way, then you know that essentially critical theory has conquered our legal system.
Yeah.
Which I don't think is anywhere close to happening anytime soon.
Yeah, that's going to be a pretty tough sell, even for some judges that would probably be favorable towards it, because in many ways that limits their power as well. If you made that sort of conclusion.
Yeah, because then actual conscientious objection to the law is indeed possible.
Well, right. It basically opens the door to all sorts of stuff that people consider crazy, like sovereign citizens, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, because it's a Pandoras box. You can open this up and try to do it for social justice, but you don't understand that due to the fact that it's based on the postmodern philosophers, they have every leg to stand on to say that, well, no, being a sovereign citizen is no different from that. This is my reality, and you're living in it. Get over it.
Yeah, pretty much.
So that is, to me, where I think corporations need to focus, is not necessarily on critical theory and we should adopt this because it's the cool new trend. No, what corporations should continue to do is be self-interested and adopt a hyper reality, because you're going to adopt one whether you like it or not. Okay, adopt one that serves you, your employees, and your company's interests. That's what you actually should do. And I would say that a philosophy based on nihilism is probably not the way to go.
Yeah, that's a rather cynical kind of attitude. And I understand, as a reaction to the cult of positivity that was identified in many corporate environments from the 80s to 90s, early 2000s, that sort of thing. It's understandable as somewhat of a reaction to that, getting a foothold in corporate.
Oh, yeah, and corporate is already filled to the ears with all kinds of BS and things like that. So employees are very...
They're very ready. They're very ready to be cynical in many ways.
Well, and they're very hip to anything that causes any kind of cognitive dissonance. I mean, it's why things like Six Sigma essentially failed, and why essentially Scrum at some point is going to fall out of favor, because it's just the reality does not match the sales pitch at the end of the day with most corporations.
Yeah. And so, with all that in mind, the corporation needs to be, whether it's a development organization or whatever, they need to think, okay, so what's some things that I need to do to chase whatever my hyper reality is that's going to benefit me, going to benefit my customers, and benefit my employees.
Yeah. And that's the traditional, I'm building a corporate culture kind of thing. And if you don't deliberately plan this, it will end up being something that is planned for you by people who aren't you and that don't have your best interests at heart. And that's how you go from a company that is a family that supports each other into the Manson family. Okay.
Yeah. So instead of, say, necessarily teaching critical theory or something like that mandatorily, it might make more sense to consider, well, okay, what's going to be things that we could mandatorily teach this department, that sort of thing, that makes more sense regarding what they're supposed to be about in the organization. Say if you're a marketing organization, you have them go over the book Customers for Life from Carl Sewell, because that's a great sales book. If you're reading, some things that are, say, in a development organization, get them to go over some of the seminal texts for whatever the language that that is predominant.
Yeah, and that's the big deal, is that it's quite obvious that there's almost always going to be some better use of your time than trying to inculcate this sort of culture that's just not going to serve you. Okay, as a company.
And that you also have to be cognizant that a lot of your employees as well, even if they aren't very vocal politically, do have political opinions. So you also are going to make certain members of the population somewhat unhappy with you if you do have to have them go through that sort of
in fact, the more political you get, and critical theory is obviously becoming very political, judging by the whole reason we're doing this cast, anytime you embrace anything that has become a political football, you're really going to hurt yourself as a company, because you've just now pissed off half your whole company, essentially, because some of them are going to be on one side of the issue or the other side of the issue.
One's going to be red tribe, one's going to be blue tribe,
and so
something like that.
If you're going to do that, you need to do it because it fits your business model, okay?
Right.
If your business model depends on you being woke, then be woke, okay?
Yeah,
that's fine.
If you're selling MAGA hats,
that's not going to work out, right? So, and for the vast majority of industries, I think it can certainly be very well justified that, no, this is either counterproductive or literally just neutral. It doesn't do anything for me, you know? So that's the big show, is that a lot of companies are adopting these things, and they really shouldn't, because it was already counterproductive before any kind of executive order or anything like that. So, you know, I wouldn't say that it's anything like a breath of fresh air. I just say that it's a time in which people can reflect and think whether or not what they're doing is actually serving them before they actually get the hammer of the state put down on them, because that's the last thing any business wants.
Well, and more importantly, whenever you're getting a sort of proposal to do this, where it is a highly philosophical based and highly political type of training, it probably behooves the management to actually research these thoroughly. Like, dedicate some serious time, man. Even if it's got to be you're going to the beach and you got Foucault with you, you know, do it, man. Because whether you agree with it or you disagree with it,
you need to understand.
You need to understand this, because that's going to be, if you do go ahead and teach this, if this actually, you know, jives with what your personality, what your corporate culture is, that sort of thing, it will help you to understand it just from spreading it to your corporation, if you actually understand the philosophy correctly.
Yeah, and you can even then decide to pick and choose what is useful to you and discard that which is not useful to you. That's the traditional way intellectual work works.
Even if, say, you're a conservative businessman, which is pretty traditional, a lot of businessmen are very conservative that own these sorts of companies, researching this sort of stuff from a philosophical perspective can also be useful to you when dealing with employees that are currently disagreeing with you on the basis of critical theory. Because at least then you understand their arguments and can at least empathize or sympathize to some extent with them.
And most importantly, put forward an argument as to why you don't agree with them in a way that is not going to upset them to the point that they're going to cause trouble. Yeah.
Right. The point is that you can find some way to frame your argument that is going to work in the context of your company. Even if it's not the most satisfactory argument, it's going to be an argument nonetheless that works.
And the idea is that it just has to be good enough. You know, whatever it is to keep everybody pulling the train in the same direction is really all you need. And that's the whole deal here, is does this pull the train forward or not? And I would argue in the vast majority of situations, probably not. So that's all we got for tonight, guys. Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow and we'll have another cast for you. Hit the like and subscribe button, and be sure to hit our PayPal link if you want to send us some dough. All right, bye.
Or consult.